Welcome to our community. Susie Thomas here with you this morning. We are so privileged to welcome Stefan King and Deb Shamlin. They are both from the NAACP of Stark County, or is there a designation there for our local chapter?
Yes, it is the Stark County NAACP because there is also a unit in Alliance and also one in Massillon. And they both, when the NAACP was big back in the 60s, each community wanted to have their own, and so we started at Stark County, and then the other two units formed.
NAACP goes back to, as you say, the 60s. Is that when it was founded as a national organization?
It was founded as a national organization in February of 1909.
Oh,
it was formed by a group of people united by cause and not by color. W.E.B. Du Bois will be the name that most people recognize, along with Ida B. Wells, who were two African Americans, and the other folks were the majority population. And it was formed at a time when there was lynching. Lynching was legal, and quite a few lynchings occurred at that time, and people came together in Springfield, Illinois, and as part of the Niagara movement to form the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Has there ever been a thought to switch those last two initials around and make it the National Association for the Advancement of People of Color or something like that? Is the CP still okay to say?
Absolutely, the CP is okay to say. It is part of our history.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that history. First of all, there's going to be some things that, in my naivete, I'm going to be horrified to hear. The fact that you just said lynching was legal in 1909. Where was that legal?
All across the United States. This organization began working on having a law passed to outlaw lynching. That law was never passed. So when we talk about the nexus and the basic tenets of the NAACP, that's where they begin. And then they continue forward up until this time, and we all remember Ferguson. So the NAACP, as you may or may not be aware, was boots on the ground in Ferguson when that happened, as it's been boots on the ground in Florida and in North Carolina, to work with the African-American community and also to work with the police community around the same issue, which as African-Americans we see as the legal lynching of African-American men by men in blue.
Oh, gosh. Deb, you are president of our Stark County chapter, yes?
Yes, I am.
Stefan, vice president?
Vice president, yes.
The two of you obviously have stories that have made you become involved with this organization. Can we learn a little bit more about each of you?
My family has been part of the NAACP since it started, so it's a generational thing. And I think most of our members and I think of our officers, it has been the same for them. Their parents were involved. The NAACP was very instrumental in the passage of the Civil Rights Act as well as the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so when you think of all of the public demonstrations that occurred right up and including the March on Washington, the NAACP was the organizer of those. We were the organization that once you went to jail and you demonstrated, you had to be bailed out. And that was the NAACP that did that. Mm-hmm. When you look at the students that sat in at the lunch counters, those were the youth and college units of the NAACP. So for me, it has been a part of my history, my personal history, and my family history.
You said you grew up in the South. Before we went on, you mentioned that you grew up in the South, and Stefan, you did as well?
Yes.
Where did you hail from?
Well, myself, I was born and raised in Louisiana, and as Deb stated earlier, right, I grew up watching the NAACP and being affiliated with many of the officers and in my family as well, but really never found myself being active, until I got older, graduated college, right, and, got out of the Army, right, and found out that I needed to be active with this organization, right, that I had seen my family to be, so well versed with, and growing up in Louisiana, it's a little different than the North. It was, racial discrimination was wide open. It was legal. It was legal, as we were talking about earlier, and lynching. It was legal to, for a person of color to get beat. So I found myself, really wanting to be a part of this organization that, I had been watching all my life.
I'll tell you how I was raised, and then I think part of it, in all the well-meaningness, it might have been like a little bit off track, because I was raised to be colorblind. We would be taking our Bible school back in Massillon, Ohio, back in the 60s, combined with Friendship Baptist Church Bible School, and we had Bible school together in the summer, and I made friends, good friends, dear friends, and we were not from the same race, and that didn't make a lick of difference. We just got to know each other as people, as a person. And I think my parents were thinking, raising children to be, and that phrase, which I hope is not offensive to you, colorblind. And yet, when I got older, I made other friends who said, but my color is such an important part of who I am, I don't want you to be colorblind. Can you comment on that, one way or the other?
I understand the comment colorblind, and I understand what it meant in the 60s when it first started. But it's important to recognize that everyone has a history, just as you may be German, Irish, Italian. African Americans have a history as well. And so I think it was more than being colorblind. I think that it was a way to say that we want to, the word we use today is inclusion. We want to be inclusive. We want to make sure that everyone is included. And that, to me, is my interpretation of the words colorblind. A change in attitude, an open spirit, one of acceptance.
It's you, before we went on the air, you made a comment and I wrote it down. You said, we need to talk about race. I don't need to talk about race. Race is something I live with every day. I think race is something I don't live with every day. And I think if I were to describe myself, I come up with top 10 words to describe myself, the color of my skin wouldn't even occur to me. But I think that's not the experience of everyone in the community. Do you see where I'm going? And can you comment on that? Where if you are an African American male, you, Stefan, are aware that you're an African American male in every situation, or is that not fair to say?
Well, that is fair to say, but the difference is that we have different elements, right, that's in our communities, right, that cause us to pay attention to our color, in a greater sense, because we're segregated from other people. When you have, if I ride in a different neighborhood, the same as my friend Johnny that's right down the street, that's of a different race, and I ride in that neighborhood, right, he doesn't get pulled over, but I do. So I'm made to pay attention to, the color of my skin.
How in 2017 is that still a fact, what you just said there? I'm amazed that still is a fact, where I would hope you'd be able to come over and hang out at our house anytime you want.
Exactly.
In fact, it's an open invitation. But I just can't understand how we're still talking about this. This is like 60 years later.
Well, we have to remember the Civil Rights Act was just passed about 54 years ago, that this has been a country that had a different attitude up until 64 years ago, and the laws of Jim Crow, while made illegal at that time, the attitudes behind it have not died. It just is not legal anymore to say, I will not serve you lunch, I will not let you buy a house here, you may not go to school here. We have been able to strike those things down, but the systemic racism still exists.
Please help me understand what I've heard that term, and I'm not sure I understand what it means. Systemic racism.
Systemic racism is that racism is built into the systems of our society. So we have difficulty in finding jobs. How many African American CEOs are there? I can think of 3 right offhand. When you look at the opportunities that are before us, the discrimination that occurs before you can reach those levels is part of what is systemic. It is there. We look at the infant mortality rate, which here in Canton, and it has distinguished itself, It's not so much that it's a high infant mortality rate. It is important, but it is the disparity. You have an infant mortality rate where babies die before their first birthday, and we're not talking about safe sleep babies. We're talking about low-weight babies, babies born before their time. The disparity is African American babies die at 3 times the rate of Caucasian babies.
Do we know why?
I think if we knew why, we could solve the
Well,
problem.
yeah, there we go. We're trying to figure out why, aren't we?
It is nationwide. It is just that Canton has distinguished itself as a hot spot. And because infant mortality is an issue in the African American community nationwide, some of the studies point to the stress, one, of racism and poverty, and two, because hospitals in the past, when we had Jim Crow laws, didn't serve everyone equally or with equity. And so there's a distrust of what the system is when you go in for health care. And while people say, we train our doctors, yes, you train your doctors, but is the staff also trained? So that warm, caring person that you see, you've already dealt with the receptionist and the nurse who may not have that same sensitivity.
Are you working with, another thing we want to talk about is collaborations, working with some of the organizations that are really trying to do something about not just infant mortality, but really making sure that people are treated with dignity, respect, and with equality in all areas. Are there some organizations that you can collaborate with?
We have been collaborating because the mission of the NAACP is to eliminate racial discrimination, and it is to ensure that the civil rights of all races are protected as it relates to health, education, voting, employment. And with that mission, especially now, it is important that we do collaborate, because this is not just an issue for people of color. It is an issue for our society. And so what the NAACP has done is we have collaborated with the Urban League, which was formed probably 20 years after the NAACP was, and it was formed as people left during the Great Migration, as people left the South and rural America and came to urban America. And we've also collaborated with a local organization here that doesn't have a national brand, and that is Coming Together Start Counting. And so together we have worked to bring the voices of the people of the community together in a safe place to talk about what affects the African American community and the things that, as a community, we are concerned about.
We're going to want to talk about what some of those things are. When we hear the term racist, it's one of those terms that just makes you sick at your stomach, doesn't it?
Susie, you had brought up about how you were raised.
Yes.
And the small town that I was raised in Louisiana, we had missionaries. My grandmother had and grandfather had missionaries to come into our home. They didn't look like us, right? So, that's not how I was taught. That's not how I was raised, right, to actually pay attention to the color of my skin. I already knew that, I'm a black man. I'm a young black man, right? Right. But I was also taught to respect, those that were not, that did not look like me, right? And, I was raised in a Christian home too, though, right? I wasn't blind to see that these people that were in my, in my grandmother's home, right, that they didn't look like me, but I had all the respect in the world for them because they were bringing in, this is a Christian station, they were bringing in the Word of God to us, right, and it didn't matter what they looked like. All that mattered is that they were bringing the truth, and the truth was, from the Bible. But everybody doesn't get that.
Yeah. We were very fortunate and blessed, weren't we, to be raised by the parents we were. I wonder, I'm looking at the clock. All right, you know what? On that note, let's take a little break, and we'll be back right after these words. You're listening to Our Community.